All right, getting into section 6.4, which is fractions, decimals, and percents. And it's just three different ways to represent a number. So our learning targets today are being able to express fractions express percents as fractions and fractions as percent, so both ways, and express percents as decimals and decimals as percents. We've already looked at fractions to decimals and decimals to fractions. All right, so this is just an extension of that. All right, and a percent is just a ratio that compares a number to 100. For example, right, 3/4 is a fraction that I have, but I can represent that as a decimal. If I type in 3 divided by 4, my calculator tells me 0.75, right? And we know that that's 75 hundredths. And I can represent that as 75%, right? So these are all the same thing, just different ways to represent them. So I can represent as a fraction, I can represent as a decimal, I can represent as a percent. So starting out with percents as fractions, right? Remember, a percent is just a ratio, right, or a fraction that compares a number to 100. So what I can do is I can take this value, 45, and that's 45 out of 100. But it's not as easy as that because we want to write it in simplest form, which means I have to reduce it. And I know that 5 goes into both of them, right? 5 goes into 45 9 times, 5 goes into 100 20 times. So 45% is the same as 9 over 20 as a fraction. 120%, right? Again, to write it as a fraction, we just write it over 100. And I know that 20 goes into both of those. Goes in there 6 times and there 5 times. Now 0.5, okay, 0.5 out of 100. Okay, now you can't really write a decimal in a fraction. All right, so the first thing I want to do is I want to get rid of this decimal value. Okay, and so to move a decimal to the right, we have to multiply by 10. Okay, if I multiply by 10, it moves it 1 to the right. If I multiply it by 100, it moves it 2 to the right, and we'll be doing that later on in this section. But 0.5 times 10 would be 5, and 100 times 10 is 1,000. Okay, now when I look at that and I say, okay, well, multiplying by 10, I'm really only multiplying by 1. So I'm changing the look of it, but I'm not changing the value, right? Because timesing by 1 keeps this fraction the same. Meaning if I were to type in 0.5 divided by 100, I would get the same value as if I did 5 divided by 1,000. My calculator would tell me the same thing. So I'm changing the look of it, but I'm not changing what it's equal to. Now, I know that 5 goes into 5 one time, and 5 goes into 1,000 200 times. So that is what 0.5% looks like. Now, let's just think about that. 1% would be 1 out of 100, right? And so half of that would be 1 out of 200, right? So that makes sense, or that should make sense as the representation. Now, 83 1/3%. The first thing that I want to do is I want to turn this into a top-heavy fraction. So if I did 83 times 3, that would give me 249 plus 1 would be 250 over 3, right? So I did 3 times 83 plus 1, so it'll be 250 over 3. And then we're going to divide that by 100. All right, and the reason I did that is just so we can go and remember how we did our fractions, right, when we did our basic skills with fractions. So if I'm dividing by a fraction, right, dividing by 100 over 1, it's the same as multiplying by the reciprocal, right? This is the same thing as dividing by 100. It's multiplying by 1 over 100. So we get 250 over, right, because we multiply straight across, over 300. Now, I know that 50 goes into both of these, right? 50 goes into 250 5 times, and it goes into 300 6 times. So 83 and 1/3% can be represented as 5/6 as a fraction. All right, so when we turn a percent into a fraction, we divide it by 100, right? And then we simplify as necessary. Now we're going to look at percents as decimals and decimals as percents. So to turn a percent into a decimal, we're going to divide by 100, which we just did, right, as a fraction. For example, we were turning this into a fraction. We said it was 28 over 100, right? And then I simplified as necessary. Now, to get it into a decimal, I just do 28 divided by 100, and my calculator tells me 0.28, right? If I did 8 divided by 100, right, that's 8%, that would be 0.08. So this part right here, we move, decimal 2%. So I think this is, did I do this wrong? So percent to decimal, we divide by 100 or move the decimal 2 places to the left. Yeah, so we start here, right? It's 8.0. I move it 2 places to the left. I have to have that 0 there, right? So this is 375%. If I move it 2, that would be 3.75 as a decimal, right? And what you can do is you can take 375, divide it by 100, but that's essentially what it does. It moves the decimal places to the left, right? So 0.5%, if I go 1, 2, right, I need another 0 holding that spot. Now, to turn a decimal to a percent, we times by 100, right? So 0.35 times 100, right, would be 35%. And all that does is it moves the decimal 2 spots to the right. So here, 0.019, move that to would be 1.9%. Here, 0.8, I move that 1, 2, right? There's a missing digit there, so I put a 0 in. That would be 80%. Here, move that 2 to the right. That would be 352%. Okay, so to turn into a decimal, we divide by 100. To turn into a percent, we times by 100. Now, turning fractions into percents. Okay, there's a couple ways that we can do it. We know that it's out of 100, right? So sometimes it's going to be an easy value, meaning I know that if I multiply 5 by 20, that would give me 100, right? Well, I have to multiply by 1, right? Because 20 over 20 is 1. So I have to multiply the top by the same thing. 4 times 20 would be 80, right? So that would be 80 out of 100, which is 80%. Okay. Now, probably the easier way to do this would be to turn it into a decimal, right? 4 divided by 5, if I plug that in my calculator will tell me 0.8. Right? And then we know that in order to turn a decimal to a percent, I move it 2 to the right or I times it by 100. And that would give me 80%. All right. So take a minute and see if you can turn 2 through 6. So pause the video here, 2 through 6 into a percentage. All right, let's see how you did, and we'll talk about a few of these, right? Looking at 9 over 4, I know that the top number is greater, right? I mean, if I turn that into a mixed number, 4 goes into 9 twice with 1 left over, right? So I know that's 2.25 as a decimal, times it by 100, that gives me 225%. 7 out of 8, right? 4 out of 8 is 50, so I know that that's more. 8 out of 8 would be 100, so it's a little bit less, right? If I type in my calculator 7 divided by 8, I get 0.875. We move our decimal over twice, and that gives me 87.5%. Right? 2/3, we should recognize that as 0.6 repeating in our calculator, right? Which means 0.6 keeps going. So if I were to move that 2, right, I'd have to round that up to 7, right? 66.7%. 15 over 7, right? 7 goes in there twice, right, which would be 14. And there'd be 1/7 left over. And I know that twice means that's going to be 200 and something. And if you type in your calculator, you end up with 214.3, right? You type in 15 divided by 7, turn it into a percent, you times by 100. 3 divided by 10 is 0.3. Times that by 100, you get 30 or 30%. All right, comparing numbers, right? We want to be able to get them into the same form in order to compare them. And when we do that, decimal's probably the easiest. It doesn't have to be. You can turn them into fractions and compare them. You can turn them into percents and compare them. But decimal's probably the easiest one to compare, right? So it says in a survey, 55% said they get their news from local TV. So 55% TV. And then it says 3 out of 5 or 3/5 said they get their from newspaper. So we want to see which source do more people get their news, not dough. So remember, to turn it into a decimal, I'm going to divide by 100, right? Which means move it to the left 2. And if I did 3 divided by 5, that would give me 0.6, right? Or 0.60, right? And if we want to look at it as percents, right? 55% versus 60%, 0.55 versus 0.6. So more people get their news from the newspaper because 3/5 is a greater value than the 55%. So we can change them to the same form to determine which value is larger, smaller, equal to in that case. So our assignment for today starts on page 284. You're going to do 16 to 48 even, and then 57, 58, and 66. Please do that on a separate sheet of paper. If you have any questions, please let me know. Hope you have a great day, and we'll talk to you soon.